Chapter 1.8.3 Pod Security Admission. In Kubernetes v1.25, the pod security standards allow for different isolation levels to be set for pods, determining how their behavior is restricted. The built-in pod security admission controller enforces these standards at the namespace level when pods are created. This feature ensures clear and consistent restrictions on pod behavior. It is recommended to consult the documentation specific to the version of Kubernetes being used, as this feature is part of the v1.31 release. The built-in pod security admission enforcement makes it easier to implement and maintain secure pod configurations. Pod security levels. Pod security admission enforces requirements on a pod security context and related fields based on 3 levels: privileged, baseline, and restricted, as outlined in the pod security standards. More detailed information on these requirements can be found on the pod security standards page for a comprehensive understanding. Pod security admission labels for namespaces. The text explains how to configure namespaces in Kubernetes to define the admission control mode for pod security. By setting specific labels, users can choose which predefined pod security standard levels to use in each namespace. These labels dictate the action the control plane takes in response to potential security violations. Users can configure multiple modes and set different levels for each. Examples of usage are provided in the article Enforce Pod Security Standards with Namespace Labels. Workload resources and pod templates. Pods can be created indirectly through the creation of a workload object like a deployment or job. The workload object includes a pod template and a controller that generates pods based on the template. To prevent violations, audit and warning modes are utilized for workload resources, but enforcement mode is only applied to resulting pod objects, not the workload resources themselves. Exemptions from pod security enforcement can be defined to allow the creation of pods that would otherwise be prohibited due to namespace policies. These exemptions can be configured in the admission controller and must be explicitly enumerated. Requests meeting exemption criteria are ignored by the admission controller, bypassing enforcement, audit, and warning behaviors. Exemption dimensions include usernames, runtime class names, and namespaces. It is cautioned that exempting end users may only exempt them from enforcement when creating pods directly, not when creating a workload resource. Controller service accounts should generally not be exempted to avoid implicitly exempting any user that can create corresponding workload resources. Updates to certain pod fields, such as metadata, active deadline seconds, and tolerations, are exempt from policy checks. Modifying SCOMP or AppArmor annotations may still trigger policy violations. Metrics. The KubeAPI Prometheus metrics related to pod security include pod score security errors total for errors preventing normal evaluation, pod security evaluations total for policy evaluations excluding ignored or exempt requests, and pod security exemptions total for exempt requests excluding ignored or out-of-scope requests. These metrics provide insight into the security status and enforcement within a Kubernetes cluster.